relationship or in community rightly because of our economics. And I just want to touch on this reality that we are doing this as people of faith and out of a biblical witness that drives us to this. There are some contexts where we're in where race or class or other things might be sort of a politically correct topic, right? And I don't know if in our city, in the places where you have conversations, maybe in your neighborhoods or your churches, I don't know if these are topics that come up a lot, that are popular, that are divisive, that are just lived realities, where people might be like, well, yes, this is where we live, and yes, this is how it goes. In some contexts, though, I think we can be challenged to think that either we are rediscovering this, or we are, voting on something and we're trying to pass something new, we're trying to bring up a new topic. And for me, this is just rooted in the reality that this is the most often talked about topic biblically from Christ, is our economics. So 1 out of every 3 statements, if you had a red letter version Bible, 1 out of every 3 of those red sentences is around caring for the poor, warning to the rich, or directions about how we handle our economics. So I relocated to Seattle about 1.5 years ago. And one thing I noticed in the city right away was an economic segregation that was tied with race. But as I walked around, as I was getting to know communities and places that we do ministries and families who come to our church and are active, I did not hear many people who were even able to respond when I asked, well, what color community are you in? Or what's the rent like? Or how far south do you have to live to pay under $2,000 a month in rent? These were new things. And people were not able to talk through that or have that conversation as quickly, in my experience. But I was asked right away certain other topics around faith. Right? I was asked, well, what's your stance on sexuality? That's an issue, that's something that people connect or attach or want to talk. They have a position. Nobody asked me, how much do you give away? How much do you make? No one since I moved here has asked me that. Why is it that the central issue in Jesus' teaching around finances, around economics, around the justice of that is something that is either, and myself included, we are too comfortable with it, we're too used to it, we're too able to sort of separate out, well, that's for Pharisees and that's not for me, perhaps. There's something around our economics and the divisions that come with it that we saw, these neighborhood divisions. I don't know that we have the language. I don't know that we have sort of the eyesight to even see it and then to know how to walk into it. And I just also want to name, David said this too, we are looking at difficult, personal, deep topics. Race is, of course, this important, but also it can be a challenging topic to try to talk about wealth. When you put money in there as well, the denomination that I'm a part of, I've helped write some different these statements and resolutions on our theology around different topics. The number 1 resolution that was handed back to us that we had to do 3 times, everybody got upset and nervous about, it was not the resolution on the criminal justice system, pornography, sort of these different, these aren't easy topics, right? The number 1 difficult resolution that we had to do 3 drafts on, guess what the topic was? Money. It was how we handle our finances and economic justice in the church. We had people nervous about using the word jubilee in there. We had people nervous about any kind of words that could sound socialist, their words. And we in the committee were saying, well, so this is, a Bible verse. This was not, we didn't create this. But what we found was a definite reaction to even holding up how central economics are in the biblical witness. So I just want to, this is not brand new information, but just to ground again, instead of some of the other maybe check boxes that we could use to define ourselves, our faith, our community life, I wonder what it would look like to start again by saying the biblical witness on economics and justice and the disparity between the wealthy and the poor, that should be a conversation that we not only have in the church, but that we influence, that we know how to have a conversation. I should be asked how much I make, where I spend, who I spend my money on, what kind of products. and what my neighborhood and my geographic location has to do with that. So, next slide. We heard a bit of this already, which I was not surprised by and encouraged by. But just to name this reality again, that these economic divisions that we experience and that the church is marked by, these are both personal and systemic. So on one hand, it could be an individual who's had an experience of financial hardship or whose ancestors had certain economic options or didn't, and those are real and valid. And sometimes, especially in our churches and our schools, communities, we need to talk about those. We need to help the individual get a mortgage or figure affordable rent or those things. But it's the systemic pieces, especially when we talk about segregation, right? Especially when we look at the histories of certain neighborhoods where you could get loans for homes and other neighborhoods where you could not. And when we talk about things like generational inheritance of wealth, what I have found, too, for me, is growing up economically challenged. For me, that suffering actually helped me understand some of the challenge of racism, some of the systems that happen. Not the same thing. But I ran into kind of that benefit of social capital. When I hit high school, and I started hearing people say things like, oh, you need a car, well, don't your parents, I'm going to give you one. Or, oh, you need a job. So-and-so's dad has a job. You'll have a summer job. And I don't know if you've heard, if you're somebody who that was normal in your life, or if you were somebody who heard statements where you were like, who's going to give you a car? Who has a car? Or when you get older, friends who'd be like, well, my parents will give me a down payment. Well, my dad will hire your husband. Whatever. There's these generational, again, it's personal because it's individuals, but it's systemic. Because there are relationships, connections, social capital that hooks certain people up, and other people don't even, it's not like they don't have a fair playing field, they're not even on the same field, right? So understanding, for me, it's really helpful to be able to even just in my mind think through, this is a personal, compassion, direct, one-on-one conversation, or ministry, or need. This is about a person. But other times, to press this now, this here, this is a systemic issue. This is a whole community. This is a history. This is why this college has an endowment or funding and why this one doesn't. And why this group of students can always get on that trip to go overseas and this group can't. And why this family over here is still trying to figure out how to pay for childcare and that family over there has that covered and always has. Again, sometimes there's personal choices or responsibility that's in there. But there are systems, and you might have seen some of these illustrations. It's like one whole group of people started a race way at the front. So they've got maybe 3 feet to go to the finish line. And other groups of people are starting, 8 miles back? Way back. So of course some of it is how fast you run and how direct you are and how focused and how you train and your choices. But if you're starting way up there and everyone else is starting way back there, that's a system. For me, there's also a spiritual component here. Just to name, again, this is not brand new information, but understanding that our reconciliation with God out of our faith as well, the right relationship, reconciliation this way, it's also about remembering this personal and systemic, right? So reconciliation as a people of faith is a spiritual and a social act. It has to matter in my individual prayer life. It has to have those markers of individual faith and discipleship and faithfulness. But it is also a social act to be rightly reconciled with God. Because I'm not in right relationship with God if I'm not looking at 1 out of 3, the topic that Christ talked about. I can't be. I cannot really be understanding and listening and faithful if I'm not trying to live into all the social community realities that relationship compels me toward. So it's personal and systemic economics, but it's also a faith dynamic of a personal commitment and also a communal commitment. Next slide. When I try to think about when we put these two pieces together, right? Race and class. These together are two of the most powerful privileges or lack of privileges that have defined our nation and, by extension, sadly, much of our church. And some of this relates to comments that come out sometimes where people feel like, well, you're adding the race card here. Or you are adding, and people don't really say you're adding the economic card, but it's this idea that people are bringing up things that are either new or shouldn't be in the equation. If you notice the story of desegregating the schools, that sentence that David highlighted, it said the schools were already integrated anyway. So somebody was saying that this isn't a problem, because out of her perspective, probably Queen Anne, she didn't see that context, right? So she was saying, in my experience, out of my context, I don't see this as being linked. I just want my individual daughter to participate or do this, or other individual kids to participate. But this is a reality that has shaped, and many of us know this, but it's a reality that already shapes, already defines, already segregates, it's telling a story. It's a story that started hundreds of years ago, and it started with how we used our land and how we used our labor and the people and the building, the literal infrastructure of our cities, of our nation's capital, our highways, our communities. It doesn't mean that we should feel like there's nothing we can do, but it means that we need to acknowledge that these divisions and the power underneath them have been at play for literally hundreds of years. So it wasn't a mistake. In Chicago, for example, the main highway that goes through downtown Chicago, Highway 90, there's this little area where it goes like this, and then it keeps going. It was because it was built to separate the white and the black side of a neighborhood, but this right here was Mayor Daley's tennis club. So you gotta have it on your side. It was not a mistake. And I think for me, as I grew older, as I saw some of the specific privileges and power, again, systemic structures that had happened over the years, I realized if we are doing work in communities, if we're doing work in the church, if we're trying to look at our faith and how it impacts race and class, I can't do that as a woman in my 30s unless I understand, well, who built that highway? Or who built that wall in Detroit? And why did they build it? These things did not just happen. They weren't a mistake. It wasn't an accident that certain sides of town didn't get the mortgage and others did. There was a set of powerful privileges and opinions that set the course of most of our cities, many of our rural regions. It's just a reality that now we are already living into. So both race and economics and the privilege there, it already sets our landscape. It already has colored many communities. And a lot of communities have colored it, they live this. But partly are naming this out of the white community to be able to recognize that there's a history and a reality already happening. And the church has a different answer. We have a different promise. But the church is also already walking in that reality. This is not a brand new information. There's no such thing as a card to be played in the last meeting. It's naming something that is already happening and defining and in many times limiting our neighborhoods and our churches. So that leads me to the next one. Next slide. Context and cultural location matter. And there's always a choice, I think, within that. A choice to see, to listen to others, and then to act. There's something especially about choices for those of us who engage in looking at race and economics who have privilege. So I think there is a white privilege and there is economic privilege. There are different places where this comes into play, but this again is that systemic reality to acknowledge that as individuals, maybe we have struggled. As some of the most radical and faithful justice advocates I know are white people who struggled economically or in other ways, and they could then understand and turn that into understanding. They did have privilege in other places. They could wrestle and they could redeem, and then they could go into other people's stories and hear and listen and acknowledge what white privilege looked like. And the same thing, there are different communities of color where, so like in the African American church, a lot of my experience in Chicago, there was no separation there in talking about a personal faith and getting a job next week. There was no separation between understanding if you don't have an opportunity here economically, I will not only pray for you, but I will go with you to that job interview next week. There was this connection around understanding power and voice and lack of power and voice. And I think naming, those of us who are in this conversation and either are white leaders or in churches that are predominantly white or even multicultural, there is something powerful to just name that it is a choice to engage. It's a choice to see how race is impacting and segregating and active in different neighborhoods. And for those of us with economic privilege, that's another choice. It's a choice to say, oh, well, that is a different kind of inheritance. That's a different kind of systemic reality. And then to consider in our own individual stories, in our own individual call to being faithful, well, how does that interact? So that leads to the next slide. I think it helps to name that this, again, this is difficult. There's a reason that was the resolution that got sent back. Because, I mean, maybe even now, we're starting to sort of wrestle internally or think about, well, what does it mean to come out of the context, the racial and the economic specific background that I come from? And what does it mean for my church, my community, my school, where my kids go to school? And I think part of what I have found to be really helpful in encouraging each other to be faithful is to name that this is difficult and that we are walking on long track pathways that are not going to evaporate or change overnight. But that the call here is not for guilt or for saying, oh, I didn't do that, or that didn't benefit me, or I don't have privilege, or comparing. I mean, sometimes there's kind of this comparison around race and economics that can be difficult. I think instead of that, what we're aiming for is wherever we're starting from, whatever we bring from our context, is to strive for awareness and engagement and building that community that we're listening to so that we can then act, so that we can be faithful. And again, I think two of the important questions, we ask this of our church leadership a lot, different lay leaders who work with me on global and local issues. We talk about personally, how do we pray about this with each other? How do we support you? Where are there places where you're growing, or you need to grow or be challenged? And then we talk about systemically, how does this impact our church leadership and our power? How does this impact the fact that our church is an inner bay? So we are in between these geographic locations of high economic privilege and primarily white racial privilege. And when we moved to Seattle, I struggle with it all the time. I'm living in Ballard, which, if you know, is not very racially diverse. And my daughter went from a preschool where she was a minority to, and she asked every day, how come all the kids here look just like me? Her elementary school is 92% white. We live there because it's 5 minutes from church. We didn't want to have a long commute. We got a deal for Ballard. We got a rental that we could make work, right? So many of us are maybe struggling with where we live, where we locate, who our kids go to school with, and depending on where you come from, and where your church comes from, and what you've inherited or not, and what you feel and your church and your community feels. What is God calling us to now? This verse in Isaiah, it's one of my favorites, and again, there's literally hundreds of verses around how we engage with the poor and with poverty and with oppression. But this is just one that I like to hold up, and you've probably heard it, but it speaks to the reciprocal nature of doing this. So it's not, again, that recognizing or naming our choices and the kingdom call to engage makes us stuck, but there's a reciprocal nature here. So here's Isaiah. And if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry, and if you satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. And if you know Isaiah, this whole section is about the prophetic call to align ourselves, to be reconciled with God in a way that lets us then notice these disparities, that lets us notice how, and actually a lot of what happened in the prophet's time was also racial, but it was definitely economic. and noticing that spread between what rent cost and who was paying off who and who had the privilege. And Isaiah is reminding us here that when we engage in that, and when we are willing to address those without, and understand why maybe those of us who have, that there's a reciprocal relationship, that we will grow, and we will be rewarded, not in even sort of that eternal sense, but even now. It's part of what we need to do, out of our discipleship. So here's our last slide, and then we're going to keep hearing from more voices. So it's a really small font. But I'll just read you some of the highlights on here. And this is meant to go into some practical and some hopeful steps. So as we integrate, right, as we're moving into what does it mean to move, to understand the context, to understand the personal, to understand the systemic, and just given that we have highways and roads and neighborhoods already built, what might it look like? And these are just some practical suggestions that others have shared with me and that I've learned. The first that you might not be able to read is exegete your community. So it means understand your context, understand your neighborhood and your kids' school and your church's neighborhood and schools, and know that it is not going to look the same for everybody, and it shouldn't. And those people who come to your church or are shaped by your church are looking for something that is rooted in your context. And it doesn't work to try to beat anybody else's context. The second bullet point up there, understand your own social and economic location. So even asking yourself, where do you come from? How have you experienced race, or have you? How have you experienced economic privilege, or lack of that? What are the stories that maybe you need to hear or understand? Or what is the background or the history that you are operating in, that your church is operating in, that you may need to understand? The next one, there's two resources that I want to just name for kind of understanding communities and understanding how resources are distributed. And that's asset-based community development, ABCD is the acronym, and then the other one is Christian Community Development, CCDA, for the Christian Community Development Association. Both of these groups talk a lot about how you know your neighborhood or your community, how you understand geography and race and place and economics, and how you look for assets, how you look for people, how you look for indigenous leadership, how ministry is shaped by all of those realities. So if you haven't read or thought much about this, or you're just interested in some new resources, I'd Google ABCD or CCDA. The next one I had down is talking about reconciliation necessarily means talking about hope. And there's even some of the same language that we just saw from David, but we are pointing toward the promise of reconciliation that is already partly here, but it's also not yet. And so it's living in the tension that we are aiming for something over there, but it will probably take years and years and maybe generations. But that doesn't mean that we don't do it and that we don't point toward hope in doing it. And my last point here, biblical justice lets us reimagine what could be. Because we are rooted in the not yet, but we are grounded in the day-to-day. I think there's that challenge to have the theology and the analysis and be able to understand our communities and our churches and our facts, and that's really important. But there's also just the day-to-day reality to name, what do I do now that I live in Ballard? And what do I do in a church with a lot of people who live from different neighborhoods? We have folks who come from way south and way east and way north, and then these economically well-off hills that are all right around Inner Bay. What does that mean for who we are? What does it mean for where we buy our stuff on the weekend? Or who we have up front, and who leads, and what voices we understand, and what history we tell, right? So it's knowing the analysis and the big picture, but it's also just the day-to-day, how we practically and with hope live out trying to be reconciled with our economics and with our race. So thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Drs. Dion and Davis. As you guys are gathering your thoughts and questions, we will say that, guys, I know it's a lot.